Sunday, I was given the opportunity to preach at the Church of the Brethren in Western Port, Maryland via Zoom. The Gospel according to John, chapter 15. So I'm going to read the passage that I used and just give you a little Facebook Live of my sermon from Sunday. So the scripture is entitled, "The World Hates the Disciples." If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecute me, they will prosecute you too. If they obey my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done among them the works no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. As it is, they have seen, and yet they have hated both me and my Father. But this is to fulfill what is written in their law. They hated me without reason. Hatred can be such an ugly thing. Yet, as a pastor said a couple of weeks ago, it's become so easy for us to use the phrase, "I hate," whether it be in reference to a person or to a situation. According to an article I read in Science for the People, the majority of the time, people don't say hateful things because they are a cruel, judgmental, antisocial person. Instead, a lot of the times it's common feelings and a psychological need that brings out the worst behaviors in some individuals and prompts them to say negative statements about another person. People at times need a scapegoat. They need someone to take their feelings and frustrations out on. Sometimes people find it easier to connect with others through negative interactions. Sometimes hate can come from fear of the unknown. I wonder if this could have been behind the hate that Jesus was speaking to his disciples about. In today's passage, 3 reasons are given for the hostility and hatred of the world. One of the reasons was because the disciples didn't belong to the world. The world hated and persecuted Jesus. The world doesn't know God. In hearing these things, I hear a need for the world to find a connection to something, even negative. In a way, the world needed a scapegoat, which was to persecute Jesus because they would rather do that than face a change in the culture that Jesus was pushing for. I also hear a fear of the unknown. They didn't know God, and since the world loves its own, it cannot love the disciples as they were not of the world. The world hatred of Jesus, this hatred the world had, and the rejection of his teachings was an open door for persecution. There was a perseverance in wanting to eliminate Jesus, to kill him. The hatred was soon crowned in the shouts of "Crucify him." And due to the way they treated Jesus, the world would eventually treat the disciples the same way, and they were called to continue the ministry after his crucifixion. Because the disciples identified with Jesus, the outside world would persecute them, because the world truly did not know God. Church has always been a big part of my life. My mom and dad made sure I was involved in youth group and Sunday school. I was blessed to be in the senior choir and starting in middle school, and as well as the bell choir in middle school. Because I was so involved, I often had to prioritize my extracurriculars. There were times I was left with hurtful and hateful feelings from teammates who made me feel like dirt for choosing church over team dinners. It wasn't that I didn't want to go. but I also knew where my commitments were. The team dinners were often electives, not something that I had already committed to. By choosing to leave after practice and head to church instead of heading to someone's house, I was an outcast. I felt like the team looked at me as if I wasn't truly a team player. And for the longest time, I held resentment towards my teammates because I felt I was never good enough. I felt like I was the team's scapegoat, especially if we would lose. It was easiest to blame me. And that impacted the attitude I had towards my teammates. The ugliest side of me would come out, a side that I'm not proud of. And in looking at it in hindsight, was my reaction to my teammates any better than the way they were treating me? I don't think so. The passage I read has sometimes been difficult for me, as I sometimes read it, especially initially, as a very judgmental side of Christ in his outlook on the world. But then I realized it wasn't that he was judging the world. He was explaining to the disciples why the world looks at them the way they do, including the way the world looks at Christ. He does project a sense of guilt for the way the world reacts. In verses 22 through 24, Jesus says, "If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done among them the works no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. As it is, they have seen, yet they have hated both me and my Father." Jesus wasn't saying that if he had not come, the world would have been sinless. Let's face it, that's not even a possibility. Instead, because he came, because he spoke the truth in his travelings, in his encounters with people, in every location under the sun, whether it be just out in the gardens, along the shore, in a boat, because he offered those messages, he in some ways incited the severest and most deadly sin, which is the rejection and blasphemy of God the Father. He spoke about being a light in the world, the bread of life, the good shepherd, the way, the truth, and the life. Christ had done so many miracles to prove to the world he was the Messiah. But the world was so aggressive in the love of sin and the rejection of the Son of God. This passage ends with verse 25, which was a quote from Psalm 69:4. David, who is the one that wrote this psalm, knew that because he was hated by so many, he would likely be killed. And he called for his rescue. He cried out to God for his rescue. With how much the world hated David, how much more would he hate the Son of David, perfect and divine, the promised king? David ended this particular psalm with high praise in the coming of the Messianic kingdom. Hatred of God led to the hatred of Jesus. And once Christ was truly crucified and died, was dead, and was then raised to heaven, the hatred turned towards his disciples. So how does today's passage relate to the world we live in today? In a world so divided in this idea of how things should be, who do you look for guidance before you choose to act? In the passage, I hear Jesus say a servant is not greater than his master. There are leaders in this world, whether you agree with the decisions or not, that give guidance as to how things should be done. It is okay to question our leaders. It is okay to be frustrated. It is okay to stand up and protest when done appropriately. But when do we stop? When do we take that step back and ask for guidance on a teacher that some of us rely on the most? When do we consider the love of others and find a middle ground in a world where it is easier to speak in hate and condemnation? When do we put aside our own wants, needs, and desires in order to show others the love of God? And that love could be the answer. A Proverbs once said, "The tongue has the power of life and death." The tongue is the best weapon we have for spewing hate. I'm just as guilty for doing it. I have hated and destroyed people in my past due to my actions or my words. I can't go back and change what I have already done. The only thing I have been able to do is look at my life events, find what I could learn from them, and press on each day, knowing that I am not sinless, but I can sin less every day. I can choose not to respond in hate, but in love, even if I disagree with someone. I can choose to fight for both sides, finding common ground in love. What will you choose? In a world where a lot of folks already hate you, maybe some of you are Christ followers. Maybe some of you are just very strong and very heartfelt and persistent in your fight for what you believe in. How will you choose to respond to the world? Will it be with love or with hate? I encourage all of you to reach into the part of you that can respond with love. I hope all of you have a great rest of your day. Blessings to you all.